evening and welcome to Spooky. I'm not saying Spooky South Coast. I don't even know why. Welcome to Tripping on Legends. I am your host, Christopher Balzano. By myself tonight. I have neither a tripping partner nor do I have Ella. I hope that doesn't allow for people to drop out on me. Oddly enough, Ella has so much more of a following than I do. So I want to thank everybody that's joining us tonight. We're on 3 different platforms. We are on IG at Spooky Balzano, so if you're not following us on Instagram, that's a great place to get involved with the live shows. We are also on midnight.fm, where it is always midnight, as well as a Facebook Live. And honestly, if you are enjoying some of these conversations, and if you are wanting to get involved in some of these and kind of contribute, especially in the coming weeks, we've got some really interesting ones that I think need some audience participation. If you are looking to get involved, the best way to get in contact with us is on our Facebook page. So that's facebook.com/Tripping on Legends, and that's kind of what we call our dump spot. Thank you very much for that suggestion, Deanna. And this is episode 94, Protecting the Graves. As you can see, we have first stages done of our new set, which was we went crazy in the house with chalk paint. And so we decided to make, this is actually, I do this from where we have our dinner. This is, our dinner table now is set up with chalk paint below me. And if you can imagine, if you're looking at this through one of the platforms, if you can imagine, this is what my writing looks like in class. So imagine all those kids trying to have some kind of take some kind of notes or learn something. They ain't doing it off of my handwriting. But I wanted to give us something more interactive behind us. Give us something that's going to contribute. And hopefully it won't just be my handwriting. And now that I've got a handle on exactly what the camera shows and what it doesn't show, I can make it a little bit more. But as you can tell, right back there, at least we have hashtag TOL. At least we have hashtag Haunted Love in support of Florida, or Haunted Florida Love Stories. This has been out for almost a year. It's doing really well. I'm getting all of these reports from people across the state who are finding it in CVS's, who are finding it in Walgreens. Someone contacted me that they had found it in an office supply store, which is really cool, and that's something that hopefully you're going to be able to talk about what that has led to in the coming weeks. But there are plenty of ways to get in contact with us. There's plenty of ways to find us. If you are finding something right now, so you know we're working on, Haunted Love is always there in the background. Florida Legends is always there. If you are finding something about the Ocala, because I'm just finishing up that book, if you are finding something in your research that's a really interesting cemetery ritual, hashtag it TOL, right? If you can't find me, hashtag it TOL, and it will get to me, and I search that all the time for people who are contributing things. And it's a great way to, if you are listening from Florida, if you're listening from Massachusetts, if you're listening from Oregon, it's a really good way to say, hey, here's something going on in my community, in my town, or even the town where I grew up in, that is exciting, and it fits totally in with what you're doing. Hashtag TOL is the best way to kind of put it in front of my eyes. I want to apologize for last week's show. Last week's show was a catastrophe. I had a head up on it. If people who are new to the show, I am in Florida, and we were going through the worst part of Elsa last week during the show. I tried to do 2 different FaceTimes with my family, and I knew that the show was not going to go off the way I wanted it to. And so we started it, the connection was really bad, and so we scrapped it. Which is, to some degree, good, because there's a lot to go over with this week's episode, and I'm not quite sure we would have been able to get to it as effectively with my young sidekick riding shotgun on this one. So I would love for you to ride shotgun, for you to call in once we get the show rolling and you're kind of finding out what we're talking about. at our number, which is 813-418-6822. Feel free to call in with your cemetery ritual or anything that might fit into what we are discussing. This is another one of those shows that evolved, which I'm finding I'm doing a lot of those kind of shows, but I'm totally going to allow it. It is... It began with me in detention. What's up with that? I had to, because I had seniors last year, I had to cover the ISS room, which gave me a lot of time to research and to print stuff off before I left for the school year. And if you were listening last week, episode 93, Whistling Past a Grave Cemetery, I've started this project where I am going coast to coast and Europe as well, and I'm documenting cemetery rituals that people are doing and that people are performing that are connected to hauntings, right? So in other words, people are experiencing something paranormal in a cemetery. That's nothing new. That's the kind of stuff that happens all the time. The focus of this is people in the community go to the cemetery specifically to have paranormal activity. And it's not just like there's a random guy that walks in the... No, this is... There are people go to the cemetery, perform some kind of ritual, and in performing that ritual, they have to like honk their horn 3 times. That's a classic example I keep giving. Or they have to lay something down at the foot of something, and that makes the activity happen. And people in the town challenge each other to do it. Last week, I think our favorite one was Cemetery Mountain, where you have to take a book from a pillar and you have to run it down to the church, and the devil is chasing you the entire time. So this is the research that I've been working on as I'm kind of finishing up the Ocala book. And in doing that, and I'm in ISS, and I come across these crazy, crazy pictures of cemetery houses, right? And these cemetery houses, it reminded me, because I was going, I was going by state, right? And so one of the first ones I came across was Alaska, right? And it reminded me of probably, these are in Anchorage, Alaska, or actually technically Eklunta, Alaska. They reminded me of like when you see these Hummel, or when you see these, I think in Denmark or Norway, and they look like these little fantasy houses, and they look like a whole neighborhood set up with dollhouses, and they're brightly colored, and they were just jumping off my screen. And I was like, what are these? What? And so I started to go down the rabbit hole of these cemetery houses now, or grave houses, depending on where you're from. And I discovered that most people have never ever heard of them, and know nothing about them. And that led me to doing a little bit more research. And in my research, I found that these are huge, or were huge especially, in the South. And so I've been posting pictures, and I've been posting pictures on cemetery websites, on interesting graves, on the unknown, on different group pages all throughout the South, and even people who are in the South, even people who are nearby to where these things are located, have never heard of them, because a lot of them are deteriorated. A lot of them have broken down over the years. And yet at one time, they were a huge part of Southern culture. And as I started to research these, I came across the word, and I think it was actually posted in the Midnight Society, Tim's show, the Midnight Society's website, like their Facebook page, was the word Dagagwa. And all it said was, there is an appellation, and I've defined that. I'm going to use that word to begin with. There's an appellation belief that the Dagagwas are roaming the cemeteries, waiting to devour the living and the dead, and these houses are made to protect them. And it was totally hashtag follow the signs, because I believe it was Tracy who posted it. Didn't know that I was doing this research on cemetery houses, and she posted that. It just happened to be, totally, oh my word, that's actually what I am researching right now. And so it sparked this 3-week-long obsession with it, and I decided, this is an excellent time to get this show on the air, because while it's not a ritual we perform to get ghosts to come out, it is a ritual we perform to protect ghosts. As that was happening, as that was kind of rolling in my mind, I was asked by a friend of mine to take some people to Indian Springs Cemetery. And if you haven't listened to the Indian Springs Cemetery episodes, they're really good. And it, that's Ma McGraw, the Bloody Bucket, Marshall John Bowman, all those, Leah Sandlin, all of those great ghosts are there. And I took her to that cemetery, and I took her and some of her friends to that cemetery, and she became fixated on one grave in particular. And that grave was of a fairly young woman. I want to say she was somewhere between the ages of 17 and 23. So she was young. Didn't seem to belong to any of the families that were in that part of the cemetery. Without doing a genealogy, but her grave itself was set apart from other people. And it was surrounded by a chain link fence. I shouldn't say a chain link fence. It was surrounded by a chain that went all around the grave. And we didn't know what that was. Why was this one person marked off from everyone else? Why would they decide to put a chain around her? Now, if you've been to cemeteries, sometimes they're raised. Family plots are raised. Sometimes, there are fences around the entire thing. Sometimes it's modern, right? Babyland, for example, which is marked off by webbing because of the storms that have happened and the damage that's going on. Sometimes it didn't seem to be preserving anything. It just seemed to be keeping her in. If you've been around social media long enough, you've seen, or if you just know them, you've seen graves, I believe, especially in England, that have cages over them. Those cages were to keep people in, right? And as I started to do this research, I started to think about and look into, when we are putting cement things on top of the graves, which in some circumstances had to do with making sure if you have a low water table like me, or a high water table, I guess it is, keeping the graves themselves from coming up out of the land. But there was also religious beliefs too, right? They were scared of vampires. They were scared of the dead coming back and revisiting us. And so this started to turn around in my brain that these cemetery houses were a really good way to get into protecting the graves, right? What we as different societies do to make sure that the dead stay dead and that nothing harms them. It seems like a really obvious thing to throw out there, that we cherish our dead. At least as the remnants of a European society, there is a certain level of respect and a certain level of protection that we have for our dead. We want, rest in peace. We want there to be some kind of closure. We want that for them, and we want that for us. And if you look at the evolution and even the variations of different burial practices, you'll see a different value for the dead in all these different cultures. And it plays itself out here in America, and it plays itself out here in the South, because you have a very interesting mixture, and the ones specifically we're going to talk about, a very interesting mixture of outsiders and insiders and conquerors who have all put this mark on the cemeteries here in the southern United States that kind of play out the history of America. Like, you can track the history of this country and the mysteries of this country by simply looking at the graves. I have this quote, so I had to do a lot of research for this. If I cannot get to all this, we will do an episode 2. I went really deep today in looking into a lot of this stuff and called upon a lot of my research friends outside of the realm necessarily of ghosts. Contacted Craig Pace, contacted archaeologists from UCF, trying to get an idea on some of this stuff as I kept going deeper and deeper into it. One of the things I actually did today was I read an 80-page master's thesis on this kind of topic, specifically about the group that I'm going to talk about today. And her name is Sherry Lynn Tejada, and she was doing a study of the geological impact of graves in the South. And she had this really great quote. There's nothing less interesting than reading a quote on the air, but I have to do it. During the process of assimilation, minority groups relinquish many of their native cultural traits. However, burial practices are resilient cultural traits and one of the last to be surrendered. In other words, over the course of time, over the course of history, when one culture has overcome another one, the hardest thing to change, I teach this in history in English all the time, the hardest thing to convert is religion. Even once you get that religion thing, and you can say, no, that bunny now represents Jesus, the graves still remain. That's the last thing, and I love that word, resilient cultural trait. We are designed to protect our dead, even if different cultures don't cherish it. There was still something to the idea of needing to cherish them. So I want to talk about these cemetery houses, grave houses, I should say. If you've seen them, I've been posting pictures. They are literally a little house about the size of a... You can imagine a coffin or a casket underneath them, although there isn't oftentimes. And they're these little... They look like boat houses, right? Because they're long. They're doll houses. In Alaska, right? So in Anchorage, Alaska, outside of Condell, Alaska, they're bright, they're colorful, they look like a kid's playhouse. This one cemetery that's on the property of St. Nicholas's Orthodox Church there's more than 100 of them existing and remaining in this cemetery, graveyard in that case. And people go there all the time, and you see there's beautiful pictures of the snow on them. There are these pictures of people visiting them. They're cherished. They're taken care of and maintained, so they're repainted in that specific town, which isn't necessarily what happens here in America. So, or I should say in the Southern America. There are there were at one time hundreds of cemeteries and graveyards that had these houses, but they were much simpler, much more simple, I should say. Excuse me. Most popular in Louisiana, of which there are probably in all of the states, Louisiana and Tennessee have the most that are still kind of in existence. Arkansas, Texas, Kentucky, and then of course here in Florida. So the ones that are here are usually not painted. They're made of wood. They're made of I'm not going to say cheap wood, actually, because they're quite expensive to make. But they're not taken care of. They're kind of maintained, or they're kind of put up there for the beginning of when people die. Why? Why do we need to protect these things? Before we get into that, I want to get a little bit more into the practices and in Alaska. Let me just get Alaska out of the way because they're a little bit different because they're not of the same culture. It's said that the Athabascan Indians, that's their word, not mine, mixed with the Russian Orthodox. So essentially what you had were a Native American culture and a Christian Catholic culture that were mixing with each other, and they don't know which side these come from. Is it a Catholic idea? Doesn't seem so, although we'll get into that. Is it a Native American idea? Probably more likely. And they still exist, and they're cherished. In the southern United States, it's a little bit different. It originally started, so they can kind of trace these back to their earliest time as being in 1840. So in the scope of America, it's not that long ago, especially for something that no one seems to know about. When I posted on all these things, no one knew what was going on with them. And originally they were built as tents. And the other thing that I discovered was that when they first started building them, when they first started putting these graves in the South, they would build them on a hill. Which kind of reminds me of the hill we talked about in the last episode. They would bury people into the hill, and then they would cover them with these tents. And it was twofold. One, or threefold I should say, and this is going to be a consistent theme. It protected them from animals who generally were choosing lower ground. So a lot of the animals that they were trying to protect them from, cows, from hogs, were choosing low ground. And so the higher up you put them, the more work it was to get to them, the more they were protected from animals. The other was water tables. And then the third, or I should say, they also, by doing that, were keeping them out of the other side's hands. So early American settlers into the South, or at least in 1840, were putting them on hills so that they could protect them against the Native Americans who were in that area who were looking to vandalize them. And lastly, and this is kind of funny, and when you hear this, which I came across this kind of quote all the time, you wonder whether it was more of a joke, and like now with 160, 170 years perspective, we're just kind of like making it mean something. They thought if they put them on the hill, they were getting closer to heaven. There's even one quote that says, if you don't get to heaven now, it's not my fault. I brought you up as far as I could. Seems like it could be a legitimate thing, but to me it also feels as if it was just one of those things where it's like, oh, no, it's meant to represent heaven. I really mean it. Sure. So that was one of the ideas. And then over time, they began to build them, and it began to hold on a much more significant religious idea. The ones in Alaska are really interesting. The way that they specifically construct them, they construct them in such a way that it's supposed to reflect the religious aspects of the crucifixion, which is kind of crazy. So the way that they put them on, the way that they build them, and it's a ritual to build these, is they build this one side, and that side is supposed to represent the plaque that's above Jesus that says King of the Jews. Then they build the actual X part, which becomes the roof. And so it's a I'm not going to say painstaking, but it's a very specific way that they build it, which is supposed to represent the crucifixion within this little house. I would love to see one being built in real time to kind of get that, because I really couldn't comprehend. I mean, even being familiar with a crucifix, I couldn't see how the boards would have represented the different parts, but that's what they were saying. Oftentimes, in both the Alaskan ones and the Appalachians, we're going to call them Appalachian for a while. The Appalachian ones, you had the construction often included making a window so people could observe the dead, and so that the dead could look out as well as putting personal items in. But the big deal of it was you did no prep work on it ahead of time whatsoever. So someone died, you had to have this built before the next sunset. So you would inter the person, you would build it over them, and it's they have no foundations. You can literally with help lift them off of the grave. I should say, because most of them were destroyed. But you had to build it before sunset of the day they died. Now, if they died at night, you had a lot of time, but if they died, pretty close to the sunset, you had to assemble these very quickly. And they were made, they were built of wood, and they were religious in nature, and they often were decorated with crosses, or they were decorated. So it shows that there's definitely a Christian spin to them. One of the things that I found consistently over and over again as I was doing these was that they might date back to further back into some of the Native American tribes that are in this area. Like I said, in researching the Alaskan ones, I immediately came upon the Athabascan. Thank heavens I have no listeners in Alaska who are gonna rip me for mispronouncing that. Here in America, which is, you're gonna see the connection. We have the Mississippi tribe, the Delaware tribe, the Cherokee tribe, the Patun tribe, the Yuki tribe, or the Yuchi tribe, which I've now been doing some deep diving on them, and the Creek. So if you're from Florida, if you know Florida history, the Creek essentially, in a large degree, become the Seminoles. And if we're talking 1840 with all of this stuff, we're not too far off from the Seminole Wars. We're not too far off from where we now are officially no longer Creeks by themselves, but Seminoles. So there definitely is a passing of all of these different heritages back and forth. The interesting thing is, which I didn't think of till just right now as I'm reading this list, so many of these are also believers in Pukwudgies. So many of these tribes. Coincidence? We'll see. For the Native Americans, they originally built over mounds. So here in the South and in other places, instead of an ancient Indian burial ground, we've got mounds, right? A lot of the burials took place in mounds, not only in Florida, but through kind of the Panhandle and the things that are connected to the Panhandle, and other places in the United States too. These mounds, in some places, especially of those tribes I just mentioned, the mounds then had rocks and stones that were put on the top of it. So when we think of mounds, we think of the mounds that were in Safety Harbor, for example, and that was huge, right? I mean, that was gigantic. Or if you're in Lee County, Collier County, Charlotte County, you're talking about shell mounds, right? And that was the culture of the Calusa and of those kind of Native Americans. These are different. The burial mounds were not necessarily mass graves, although several people were buried into one place, but these stones were then put over them. So they must have been much smaller. Much smaller. And I should say, they were robbed a lot. And they were desecrated a lot. This is from the research that I did. So I'm not going to particularly attack any certain tribe or anything like that. This is the research that I heard, was that because they were, so many personal items were put in there, and shells were put in there, and items were put in there, people would often, other tribes would rob them. And these became much less religious and much more just common sense, that you buried the person and then you would build something over it so that people couldn't get in. So they were almost, in a lot of ways, like little pyramids. These walls had to be prepared by people who were directly related to whoever was being buried. Personal items were placed in. If you were preparing these burial houses, you had to be dressed in your finest clothes. And this is actually something that extends to the Appalachian version as well. This was a big deal. You were doing something really important. The body itself would be wrapped in animal skin and bark from nearby trees, and the whole rite lasted 4 days. The last part of it, and this is something that I don't fully understand, although it was something we came across when we were working with Wild Cow Prairie Cemetery, is the idea that oftentimes they were buried either sitting or standing. And then on top of them, they would have these giant stones that were placed on to protect. So imagine all that good stuff was in the hole with them. It was often dug out. There was one tribe, I can't remember in particular, who they would actually line where the person was going to be, almost kind of like the modern crypts we have now. Not crypts, but the, when we bury the whole cement thing and then put the grave in it. The whole thing was lined with stones so that the body never touched earth. And that, for some reason, was really important to them. And then the stone on top. It begs the question why we do this. So it's not just to protect from grave robbers. There is a whole mythology of cemeteries and cemetery invaders. I'm getting that from Margie, that there are still a few in Fort Walton Beach. And actually, the one that I was able to find that still existed, they mentioned Fort Walton, and then they mentioned Ebenezer Cemetery in Ocklawaha County. Essentially the county where Destin is. Although from what I've heard, the distance between Destin and Ebenezer Cemetery is pretty great. I've actually got someone who I'm hoping I can connect with who will do it. But they also mentioned Fort Walton Beach. I've actually put some of those pictures out there. And if you'll notice, Fort Walton, especially for those who don't know Florida, Fort Walton and the Redneck Riviera, as they call it, is part of the Panhandle. So it would have been a great evolution place for the Seminoles who are remaining here, especially those still connected. Thank you. Okaloosa County, not whatever I had said. Margie, you're my best friend right now. It would have been a natural crossing of cultures, because that's the path that they would have taken as they were thrown out of Florida and into Oklahoma. So that it makes sense that there would still be some left in the Panhandle. We're fascinated with the dead. It's a reflection of us. It's our separation from the ones we love, but it's also a reflection of where we think we're going to go or where we desire to go. If we don't treat our dead well, what's going to happen when we die? I don't know how many of you watch Everything Wrong With. So I think it's called Screen Junkies, and they do Everything Wrong With, and they do a certain movie, and they always have they have a sin total, ding 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 ding, and whenever they attack something, and I'm thinking specifically Pirates of the Caribbean, I was watching a few days ago, and they say who's the first person who did something that knew that this was the curse, right? Like, how do you know this? How did it come out? A lot of these things that we're going to talk about, it doesn't make sense how they first realized that this is what you needed to do. How did they know that you needed to not allow the body to touch dirt? How did they know that? Like, did someone come down and tell them that in their religion? Did someone, how did they know that they were supposed to prepare it a certain way, and that this was the only way that it would be accepted someplace? The more you study cemetery rituals, because there's less of a culture of that. If you're talking about religious ideas, you can kind of trace, you should do this, you should do this, you shouldn't do this. You've got the Ten Commandments, but how things should be prepared and how people got that it's harder to trace. It just exists. So you can imagine how hard it is to go kind of back and forth between them. A lot of religions, a lot of cultures have this idea that cemeteries, that burial sites, are places where a constant battle is going on, where the dead need to be protected from the living, from the undead, and monsters, creatures. We're going to get into some of them. But then also, we need to protect ourselves from them. We're going to talk about vampires, right? That's the classic example. Vampires and zombies are the classic examples of the dead coming back, and we don't want our dead to have that. A, because we love them, and B, they're coming to get us. So we've done different things. We've developed different rituals to keep them in. And it's not just that cage that I talked about is an extreme example. But if you have cases like Mercy Brown, where you had the body was dug up and burned right there on the headstone, so that the family could drink her ashes, so that they could become healed. If you don't know who Mercy Brown is, research it. It's a beautiful New England, Rhode Island, I believe, cemetery story, and the inspiration in a lot of ways for Dracula. We have Coon Hill, and the idea that the wall that surrounds that cemetery was so that the spirits could be at peace and wouldn't try to follow the people as they went off to Arkansas, to Kentucky, and places like that. So there's a lot of stories that involve us keeping them in, keeping them safe. But then we also have probably the stronger of the idea that these graves need to be protected. I have here, the first thing is grave robbers, right? So we've kind of talked about that a little bit. This idea that, even in modern times, people are buried with certain things. I remember getting my grandfather's jewelry back, and they were like, well, we're not going to bury him with the jewelry. Like, if people know there's jewelry, there's going to be grave robbers. And I'm like, grave robbers? Like, isn't that something from, like, Indiana Jones times? Like, what are you talking? Like, who's going to grave rob some dude, some 90-year-old guy from Cambridge, wearing his wedding ring? But it still happens. But there's a whole fleet of other people who are looking to get into your grave. Wizards and witches. There are certain rituals and certain variations of wizards and witches who rely on items of the dead, whether it's just the dirt of a grave, or whether it's a body part, or whether it's... They're required for their ceremonies. Especially those that are... And I hate to say this, but... the idea of cult and darker magic and Satanists. I remember very clearly the first time I really was exposed to this was in Freetown. And the idea that these people had broken into the crypt to get the head because they drink from the skull and they get the power of it. And it was part of their ritual. And I remember listening to Alan Alves talk about that as if it were just like a common thing like this, and thinking, wow, people do that? And we're not talking 300 years ago. We're not talking 200 years ago. We were talking, that I believe was in 94. And and my mouth is like on the floor that, yep, they go in and then they find these skulls. They drink from them. They conduct rituals with them. And that's where they get their power from. The next thing is necromancers. I searched this. This is actually one of the first paranormal books that I got. Was this book called Communing with the Spirits. And I bought it thinking this was, we're talking 95, 95, 96. I bought that book thinking that it was a book about talking to ghosts. And it's actually a necromancer's manual. I searched and I searched for the description of, it had to have been in a different book, but the ritual of the necromancer, of one particular group of necromancers or branch of necromancy, where it went through a very detailed description of how a necromancer prepared to resurrect, in a lot of ways, these bodies. If you don't know what necromancy is, it's the practice of raising the dead and communicating with them, usually with the goal of having them do stuff for you, right? So it's very closely related to kind of zombies, especially in a voodoo kind of way, in that you raise something, and because it has lost its soul, and because you are the one who raised it, you have control. And then either in physical form or in their spirit, they go out and do stuff for you. And talk, mainly. They talk. And so you can get wisdom from talking from them because they have, for however long, seen the other side. I'll tell you what I remember from the ritual. It involved... The necromancer had to break into the cemetery and dig up the newly dead. And you had to do it. It's interesting, a lot of these things talked about 3 days, 4 days, and 7 days being crucial. These cemetery houses, the grave houses, were built so quickly because there was a war going on for the first 3 to 7 days of the person being dead, where the dead would try to escape and other people would try to, other things we're going to talk about, would try to get in them, and so they had to be protected, and people had to be fooled for the first time because the soul was roaming free. This house kind of not only kept them in, but also kept other things out for that little period of time. So who cares if 100 years from now the house is deteriorated because the battle happens in that first week, oftentimes 3 days. The necromancer would go and dig up the new grave. he, and it was oftentimes, most times, according to this procedure, was a he, would remove all of the clothes from the body, rebury it, and for the next 3 days, they would wear the dead person's clothes. They had to fast during that entire time. They couldn't shower or wash themselves. And then on the third day, they would go back to the grave and raise the person up. And they would give them the clothes back. So it's very much like Dobie Elf kind of thing going on, giving them the clothes. Only it's the reverse. Because I have your clothes, I have control of you. Which is also good if you're skinny dipping. If you take someone's clothes, you kind of have, can do what you want so that they can get their clothes back. That joke goes over so much better when I've got a co-host. So we have this idea that there are people who are coming to steal your body because they want to use it in some kind of ritual for magic. Whether it's a necromancer, whether it's a Satanist, whether it's these different variants of witchcraft, they want your body parts because that gives them an additional power. And with that power, they can do more things. They can get more juice. In researching that, I found this is both a Native American that then kind of got adopted by the people who came here, especially in the South, was the concept that the first person who is buried in a cemetery is the guardian of that cemetery. So no matter what happens, whatever peace the other souls might have, the first, and it's kind of an honor thing, the first person buried in a sacred and a consecrated area is the guardian, and they will fight off any of the other bad things that are that might attack the cemetery. And in some ways, they also have more wisdom because they help people pass on and survive that transition and move and find peace themselves, whatever that peace might be. Different cultures also have other protective spirits which sometimes get distorted and sometimes get twisted. The first of these are the Grimms. And along with the Grimms, which is English, British, you have the Kirkogrims and the Kirkogrim, which are from different Nordic countries. And these are dogs. These are, and here's where the mythology of dark, large, black, like Champs over there, large black dogs that protect cemeteries. Even in a movie such as The Omen. And these are supposed to make sure that nothing supernatural can get in, and they chase everything out. In that mythology, though, you also have the corruption of these things. So the corruption of these dogs who are meant to protect, or these large animal, dog-like animals that can be enchanted, or can, at the direction especially of negative forces, feed off of the dead as well. And that's a common theme with all of these monsters I'm going to talk about. They feed off these dead somehow. There is a concept of, this is more human, but it's crazy. Once again, we're talking about Appalachian culture and the idea of the sin eaters. So different, and I'm gonna introduce this word now into our dialogue, me talking to myself, and that is the word meludgeons. And I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Meludgeons. Meludgeons and Appalachians are not necessarily the same exact thing, right? Not all Appalachians are Meludgeons, but all Meludgeons are Appalachians. They are, in a lot of ways, the lost tribe of the Appalachians. No one knows, and the majority of my research ended up because they're the ones of the Appalachian people. They're the ones who are most connected to grave houses. No one knows exactly sure who they are exactly. Like, all the research, even with modern, because they're still around today, even with modern genetics and DNA, no one can exactly trace where they come from. And they're fairly new as a people. You know you're a Meludgeon when you have dark hair and dark skin, but very light colored eyes. So there's this weird contrast between your skin color and your eyes. Now, I know that fits a lot of other cultures. Northern Italians, who are kind of a mix sometimes, they're said to be potentially the mix of African Americans, different Native American tribes, Portuguese, Polish, Russian, Creoles, people from Turkey, Arabic people, mixed, right? That there was an intermixing that was going on. And then these people essentially escaped into the mountains because they were persecuted. So what you have here is this idea that, and some of this is pre-Jamestown, they say, potentially pre-Jamestown. You have someone who is of, let's say, Turkish descent, and they come here and they mix with the Native Americans who are here, and now they are not accepted by Native Americans. They're not accepted by the Portuguese or the Turkish people that came here, and therefore, to protect themselves, they go higher into the mountains. So that's the other part of this, is that they believe Meludgeons are not and then they're mixing with each other. Meludgeons are not necessarily just one thing. They are a combination, because this happened a lot. Or what happened oftentimes is in later years, an escaped slave would mix with, I hate that word, would mix with someone who was Russian, and they couldn't live in the town. They couldn't be free one place, and so they'd go up. So it's essentially a group of outsiders who would then come down from the mountain in later years and become kind of an important force in all of those places that I talked about: Kentucky, Tennessee, Florida, not so much, but Arkansas, Oklahoma, and of course the Carolinas, places like that. One of the interesting things I found out, and I could do an entire series of shows just on them and their culture, because a lot of these things I'm talking about when I'm saying Appalachian, what I'm really talking about are Meludgeons. A lot of people believe, and this is of course the connection to the paranormal, is that they are the remnants, they're the ancestors of the lost colony of Roanoke. This is the point where I would turn like this to Ella, and her eyes would get like big, because she's obsessed with that. That, if you know the story, and who doesn't know the story, went back. There were people left here. I think it was like 100 people. Ella would be correcting all of these details right now. They came back, and it was this Croatoa was on the tree, and they couldn't find the people who they had left there. And no one has known. This is the is it pre-Jamestown, or is it? I think it's post-Jamestown, right? No one knows, or it's pre. No one knows what happened to them, right? There's been great mysteries, and pretty much the going theory now, and Craig confirmed this afternoon. The going theory, the probably the most prominent theory, is not they were taken by aliens or zombies, which are kind of some things that are talked about, but that they just went into the woods and they mixed with the Croatoans. That mixture is said to be where the Meludgeons come in, which sounds really cool, but probably just a fantasy. They have the Meludgeons have a special little helper when it comes to cemeteries. And that is called the Sin Eater. This is crazy. The Sin Eater was a cherished person in the community, but then also a completely ostracized person in the community. The Sin Eater was thought to literally consume the sins of the dead. And so they would be called in when someone died, and they were preparing the body. Keep in mind, they're preparing the body to go into these. So it's that hours as the house is being built. They would go in and they would cover the person with either flannel or white linen that would be placed over the dead. Then the Sin Eater would take ale and pass the cup over the body 3 times. Bread over the body 3 times. Butter. They never said whether the bread had to be buttered first or whether it was over the body 3 times. And the Sin Eater would eat the bread, drink the ale, and hence consume all of the bad things. So no one had to die with sin on their souls. But because of that, they were the most kind of on one hand they're cherished and they're respected in the community, and on the other, they were not allowed to actually be in the community because they were like living, breathing, walking sin. So there was definitely a lot going on with that. There's a really strong belief in the Mausoleums, so therefore in the Appalachians, that we are of 4 souls, or 4 spirits. This is not the ones we talk about, which are, the people. You have your death, and then the death of the people who knew you, like the last person who knew you, and then the death of the last person who's heard about you, right? This is kind of like that in some ways. They believe that when you die, you get split into 4 spirits. The first spirit, it remains wherever you died. So if you died in the field, that spirit will always be in the field, always. Two of the other spirits would remain with the tribe and your relatives, looking after them, doing things. Now, it didn't break down why it was 2 different spirits and what these 2 different spirits were doing, other than looking after your family and things like that. But then the 4th spirit had a 4-day journey it had to take, trying to find the haven of souls. So you had 4 days essentially to get to heaven, and you had to find where that was. If your ancestors were nearby, they might help you find it. Relatives. This is of the Yushi people who are kind of connected with the Mausoleums. So it's a Native American tribe. So you don't have the Christian influence of Jesus comes and helps you or something like that. If you don't, you're lost. You're lost forever. Your soul will never find peace, and so you come back to the graveyard, and you're lost, and you're roaming that graveyard for all eternity. Which means you, as a spirit, might come back and be a trickster. You might cause trouble, and so you were once again another person who needed to be protected from. So a lot of people are attacking you when you're dead. a lot of people kind of want your soul. Then you have this idea of ghouls. And I remember watching Salem's Lot. Who doesn't like Salem's Lot? Is there anyone who doesn't like either the book or the movie Salem's Lot? Especially even with the horrible special effects, it's still a really great movie, right? How many of us are traumatized about the scariest thing? Whenever people say, what is the scariest thing you've ever the tapping on the window in Salem's Lot. Um, Danny, come on, who doesn't get freaked out by that, right? That's one of the craziest, scariest things. I remember one of the one of the moments, and it's always stayed with me. In there is when he's got the play set of the cemetery, which we're recreating over there, and the person's like, "Well, what's this?" And he's like, "That's a ghost." He's like, "Oh, no, it's a ghoul." And he goes into a little speech about the difference between ghosts and ghouls and vampires and things like that. Ghouls are an Arabic idea, so they're kind of related to the jinn in some degree, and to genies to some degree, but they are sometimes it's pronounced ghoul or spelled ghoul like Ghul, and if it's a girl, it's a ghula, and they're shapeshifters, and they feed off the newly dead. So if you're not able to find wherever you need to go, if you're wandering the cemetery lost, there's a very good chance a ghoul can feed off your flesh. Not just your soul, but actually your flesh. It actually eats like your esoteric flesh, your you know what I'm saying? Obviously not flesh, but it's and these are, and you'll see this theme. They are often in the forms of hyenas and vultures. So it's a spectral hyena, which is seen in a cemetery. So if you see that, that means a ghoul is on the hunt. That there's a newly dead person who may or may not be lost. And these ghouls, I mean, they're like the horrendous, spiritual, ugly things. I mean, they if you look up the word ghoul, it's going to be exactly what you think the word is when you hear it, right? It's not only is it onomatopoeic, but we have these ghouls in cultures of, bald and flesh falling down and claws and, and things like that. And they roam around the cemeteries. They roam around graves. Now, the interesting thing is there is a belief that you can track ghouls, and the sighting of a ghoul in a random place is a great way to find people who have been killed and murdered, and their bodies have just been thrown. That it was tradition to look for a ghoul and even invite a ghoul when someone went missing back in the day. You invite a ghoul to come with you as you search for this person because they could tell you where the spectral body was. Then obviously 1001 Arabian Nights or 1001 Nights becomes really popular in Europe. We take this idea of the ghoul, we kind of transform it into what we want to transform it into and represent it out into the world. So the idea of what we have now is very European, but its roots trace back to pre-Muslim or pre-Islam Arabic countries. But the idea is still the same. And that tradition of giving something to a ghoul to help as you search for a missing person still remains, or maybe not today, but it still remained in European ideas into the early 20th century. Obviously, we're talking zombies, right? And we're talking zombies that are not the dead rise, but rather the dead are risen, right? And the idea that they are in the cemetery as well, and that because they are distorted, because they are cursed, even, and keep in mind, when we talk zombies, we're talking people who may have been drugged and told that they were zombies, and therefore they're acting a certain way, and they're under the control of that because they are unclean, because they are undead, they can impact other people. So if you're a spirit who is lost, or you're a newly dead person who happens to also be where someone is raising a zombie, that zombie can kind of feed off of you. Not only that, but a practitioner who has raised a zombie who happens upon another soul can take control of that soul. So there's a lot going on with that. And then we have what I believe, like I said, I believe Tracy did, which was Dagagwa. And this is what started me down the Legend path, if you will. And that is very much, I mean, it is a ghoul, except for it doesn't really change its form. It's a half humanoid, half coyote. Once again, a scavenger, right? Half humanoid, half coyote, mythological creature who is always starving, right? They're never quenched. They're always hunting, but never quenched. And they just feed off of the souls of that are lost. So especially, remember we talked about that idea of the splitting off and trying to get to heaven, and if you can't get to heaven, you kind of wander for a little bit. Or we talked about the idea that in those first few days, you're still kind of wandering around the cemetery if you don't have a cemetery house. This is why cemetery houses are created. Because a Dagagwa will just hunt constantly. And if they see a soul that is wandering, that has not found its place yet, it automatically jumps on it and kills it. Now, the interesting thing is this. Things like the Dagagwa, you don't have to believe in them for them to take you, right? So what you find are reports not in the cemeteries of like the Meludgeons and where these grave houses are. You would find reports of these and other ones that weren't protected, which reinforced the idea that there was something that was actually there. Humanoid coyote, but also it was said to be responsible for other people who went missing. So if you're lost in the woods, you might come across these Dagagwas, and they can eat humans as well. They can eat the living. So there's a lot of food going on. And it's interesting because that mixes with the coyote woman, right? So if you remember the coyote woman we talked about in the Ocala, I believe it was in Paisley, a woman who had been in so much grief that she killed herself. If you look at the Dagagwa story, her soul might have been in an unrest, right? And because of that unrest, the Dagagwa was there, and so now she becomes one of them because she is half coyote, half human. She transforms back and forth between the two of them, which is not a mix like the Dagagwa is, but it's strong enough, especially considering that it's seen on all sides of the Ocala, that it could be a variant of this Dagagwa story. Then we have probably the most famous, although I think ghouls are pretty famous, and that would be vampires. And the idea that vampires love cemeteries. Why? If vampires, this is the research I'm doing. Sounds like it might be a good topic for a part 2 as I look at our time. Why would vampires who feed off life energy and blood be interested in cemeteries? We're talking, Buffy spent all of her time in the cemeteries. Now, that was to stop the vampires who were rising. But why would vampires make their homes in cemeteries? That is a question that I think we might just wait to get into next week. I know everyone's dying to be like, no, what does George Michael have to do with the Sin Eaters? We will maybe talk about George Michael next week because the whole vampire phenomenon in cemeteries and protecting against vampires in cemeteries is enough for its own episode. You know what? Maybe we'll do like a midweek little drop and we'll just have a spontaneous live or a planned live, just a little shoot. If I had Patreon right now, I would say my Patreon subscribers could stick along to hear the vampire legend of Highgate Cemetery. But I don't. I don't currently have Patreon, but what I do have is a website, which is at www.trippingonlegends.com. I do have a Twitter account. That Twitter account is at Spooky Balzano. At Spooky Tripping is not only my Instagram, love my Instagram, but also the email, spookytripping@gmail.com. Of course, we have the Facebook page, which is at www.facebook.com/trippingonlegends. And if you go to that, you can see these other offshoots, right? Because now I've got a page that's dedicated to Boogeyman and tracking down the stories of Schaefer. From that, you can get This Town is Myth, so my research into Pemberton Ferry. You can get the Haunted Ocala. You can get the stuff that I'm still posting in support of haunted Florida ghost stories. Haunted Florida love stories. Sorry, I couldn't even say the word love in that case. And you can find out kind of what we're doing on all this stuff, and you can contribute your own material there as well. You can get the podcast, and I think I'm going to be doing the podcast differently. I think I'm going to be posting on the social medias the videos, but just doing the audio. So if you're subscribed through iTunes or through Stitcher or through Google Play, go on, please. I know every show does this, but please go on. I'm not asking for money. I don't have a tip jar. I don't got Patreon. Instead, go on and review the show. Because I'm doing a whole bunch of different things in promotion of what I'm doing. And oddly enough, good, bad, or indifferent, people judge on how many reviews you have. You know, we were talking about something, and I was talking to Jeff Belanger, and he was talking about, you know, what he does, and it's kind of like, you know, if I see that a show only has a certain amount of reviews, I have to debate whether or not it's valuable to go on there, because it's indicative of how many people listen. If you have yet to review the show, please go on and leave a review, leave a positive review. Cancel out the ones that are making fun of the way I say the word "and," because I keep saying "ant." If you've noticed how many times I've caught myself doing that. Get in contact with us. Make sure that you are telling us what you're loving about the show, what you are not loving about the show. I just looked, and Ella is yelling at me. I don't even know how she must be doing it. She must be getting it from her friend. She's literally yelling at me via text about going live without her, because I told her I would have her be on the next episode, which I know for sure I'm going to do, which is going to be all about the elevator game and elevator legends. So, you've got all the information, you've got all those good things of how you can get in contact with us and share the show and interact with the show. Please make sure you are making contact and you are becoming part of the Tripping on Legends family. I was about to say fairy family. For Chris Balzano, for Ella, who's not here, and all our guest trippers, here's hoping all of your trips